is presumably if you compose it yourself, you'll know what these are, but just so we can all hear what things sound like. So here's the bell. And you'll definitely want to have a setup to where you can easily solo instruments. This will depend and vary by DAW. Right, okay, we've got glockenspiel. Got a little sine wave or rounded off square wave synth there. Another little rounded off square with probably a layer of super saw. Fairly simple sounds. Funky clavichord. Programmed acoustic guitar. Sorry, it's a clavinet. And here's another clavinet. Now, let's identify something immediately here. We have two of this instrument part playing at the same time. It's good to be thinking early on how this is going to work together. Is my mic coming through? Can y'all hear me? Okay, seems to be a skill issue on your part, Beanie. Make sure that you have my volume on. That is a good thing. Moving on. So we have two clavinets here. Here's one thing to immediately look at for how we're going to solve this. Now, there's a sort of trick how there's two with stereo panning, but these are both center as they are. Okay, we got that. They're both playing for the most part kind of the same thing. So we'll keep in mind that these two are naturally, if we just listen to them together, when they're both center panned. Everything in this project is also center panned. For now, we'll be doing all the panning manually. These two immediately conflict, so we'll note that we'll need to separate those instruments somehow, which I'll get to. There's a guitar, another guitar, I see. Little funky electric pluck. What's this over here? A much more dense funky guitar riff. Another one with fifths and power chords. Some strings. Always touchy ones to mix strings. Some more strings. Note how this has a lower cello part. Quite nice. Let's see, a piano. Also note how this piano is playing some low notes. We have some information that seems maybe not sub-bass, but we've got some stuff around the 100 hertz area. Okay, little high guitar pluck. Got another one here. Another little synth lead. I like to always group similar sounds together, so since this is a little synth lead, I will put it next to the other synth leads because it's a similar sort of timbre, so it's faster to work with things that you know kind of sound similar off the get-go. In fact, let me normalize this. There we go. Now it's at full volume. Okay, now we can see from the waveforms here They're all just set to unity, that we have a fairly full and loud lead, another one, and 3 all stacked together. We can presume that this is going to sound too much at unity, and at unity volume means that they're just set to full volume at 0. The peak of this waveform is hitting maximum amplitude for our headroom. As we can see, RDAWs and Studio One specifically is telling me, hey, this is too loud. And yes, I'd agree with that. Note that we do have 3 different tracks here of the same synth melody being played by slightly different timbres. We might consider panning for this. Actually, generally the solution will be panning when you have multiple tracks of different timbres but playing the same thing. It'll do a nice thing and give us some stereo width. All right, let's see. There's our piano, guitar, our bass. Okay, funky, slappy, with plenty of low frequency content. Another bass. Similar sound, but playing different things at this part. Okay, here's our kick. Yep, that's a kick. Our snare. Yep, that's a snare. Here's something that's going to be tricky. Here's an actual just drum loop also layered in. Now we start asking ourselves, which is the more important part to have as our primary transient? And for the most part, it's probably going to be our modified kick and snare. This is going to be generally used as a layer. Let's see, we do have hi-hats. All right, a hi-hat loop, nice. Another percussion loop here. We know that these 3 are going to add up to be quite full. There's a lot of energy there. Simple reverse cymbal riser. Nothing too fancy. A little fill. I like to throw effects and sort of near the bottom for effects and fills, and this has quite a lot of them. This has 38 tracks. There's a little riser, little phased drum fill here. And generally with all these fills and risers and things, it's mostly just going to be setting just volume with your fader, maybe a little bit of EQ, and the rest is just going to be creative effects like this one has on it with the phaser or flanger. Little drum fill here. Another piano. Let's move that next to the other piano. Okay, nice. We hear a little bit of resonance in that piano up in the upper mid-range. Something that we'll get to sorting once we start mixing it. Some cymbal crashes. Okie dokie. A big old snare boom fill crash effect. Some chimes. A reverse snare, I do believe. Yep. Another little effect. And our final little cymbal. All right, now we know roughly the elements. We've got pianos, we've got guitars, we have kicks, we have multiple drum loop layers, we've got 3 synth leads that are both very full and very wide. We have bells, we have high-end chimes, we have strings, multiple lines, we have electric basses, and that will be our full sort of arrangement. So, what I like to do, getting into the mix, I like to always start with drums. That is what I consider to be a good bass line, B-A-S-E line, not our actual bass line. So let me throw the kick next to all the other drums. Here it is. I like to put my kick next to my bass because generally the very first thing I'll work on is the kick. The very next thing I'll work on is the bass. Right, so let's solo this kick. Nice, definitely a kick. Well, to begin, I always like to throw a simple limiter on my master as the very first thing. This limiter is going to have no gain on the threshold, ceiling going to be set to unity. This is just going to be telling me I can look if ever I'm mixing, if something's getting too hot. And by too hot, I mean loudness is summing too much. We have too much amplitude, too much voltage going to our master. If I try to turn up this kick, I can see Studio One gives me a little indication of volume reduction that, oh, this is working. I don't want my limiter to be working. This kick is already set to be maximum amplitude from the get-go. So if that limiter is working on the kick, then I know that this is as loud at 0. So this is where the kick, for the most part, should be. Now my kick is as for the pretty much set itself like this. We'll do a few little things that make it stand out a little bit more. But the kick's now kind of done for the initial mix. This is going to be our reference point to where we're going to balance everything else around this kick and get things layered in with similar volume, and then work back from there. If we end up getting a little bit too loud at times, we'll do some things to attenuate that. Now, the next thing that we know classically, that kick has a lot of low frequency content. In fact, let's throw an EQ on it. Pretty much every track as we go to mix will have an EQ on it. That's going to be one of the things that you put on pretty much everything, in my opinion, is throw an EQ on every single track because you're likely not going to leave everything untouched. I personally like to have a kick with kind of scooped mids to give some space for the rest of the instrumental, because the low end content and transients is where the kick lives. Also, kicks are important at 5 kilohertz and 8 kilohertz. This increases the perceivedness of air pressure. 5 kilohertz especially, we can take advantage of is that human perception hears 5 kilohertz spikes around this region as air pressure. So if we boost this area, let's get playing. We can add a little bit of brightness and punch to that kick, which is going to be some high frequency content that otherwise the kick would have a harder time punching through the rest of the mix with just a low frequency impulse. Same at 8 kilohertz, you can kind of boost just this whole region or a few little spikes. You don't want to be too spiky, otherwise it's going to sound harsh and resonant, but just a little high bell around this region can really help to get a kick that you otherwise aren't seeming to get punchy enough. It won't increase the bass at all, but it will increase the perception of the punchiness of the kick by boosting this region here. So if you've ever run into an issue where your kick doesn't seem loud enough, but you can't turn it up anymore, try boosting a little bit up on the high end at 5 to 8 kilohertz. It's stuck. All right, but we know our kick has low frequency content, and so does that bass. We've got 2 basses, so we'll work at both of them at the same time. They're similar sounds. Let's listen to this guy and the kick. Actually, because we've got a bass and kick happening at the same time, our limiter is telling us, and it's showing us that, oh, we're probably getting some gain reduction here. Yep, 3 decibels. That's 3 decibels of lost energy. So the classic thing to do is we don't need... Should we clip or limit to 0 with the low frequency content? We'll get into clipping about halfway through this mix. I like to put the clipper on my master once we get things leveled to where specifically we're not pushing hard at all into the limiter. The idea with this method is that our drum, we're going to make a drum bus, that is going to sum with our instrumental. And those very short 20 millisecond sums where the drum transients are summing with the instrumental will have some clipping on our hard clipper, which is going to introduce harmonics at that very moment in time. Thus, we can get a fully transparent drum mix to where when the drums hit, like the kick and snare, we get a very short burst of extremely dense saturated noise in the overall mix and onto the master channel, but everything else is untouched. We don't want our melodic content being heavily clipped, except for a few small things here and there. Instruments have their own unique characteristics with how they behave to clipping. There's a few that definitely benefit from it. If you've ever tried to work with glockenspiels, especially in any sort of VST, you'll notice that they're super bright and transient, but they're so hard to get to sustain that note. If you want to have them be loud, you either have to turn them up way too much and they freak out a limiter. When you do clip, this does introduce, it squares off the waveform. Yeah, you probably clipped too much. In that case, clipping is best sort of a light hand. If you're noticing, there's going to be a point where it starts to sound way too crunchy and way too distorted. I'll showcase that when we get to it. But a little bit of light clipping here and there is perfectly good because it adds some saturation. Right, so the classic thing is we want to sidechain our kick to our bass. We have two ways to do this in this one. Because this is a more analog style and not super like hardcore EDM or anything, I think I'm going to go with a dynamic EQ. A regular old compressor would work in this case too. But a dynamic EQ gives me a little bit more specific control because I want to keep the slap of that bass still audible. If we look at our EQs for a visual example, we can see that that guy, yunk. And that guy. Okay, so here's our kick, here's our bass. Play. Yep, they are absolutely occupying the same frequency ranges, and thus are running out of headroom here. So we can do something to solve that. C1 has nice easy sidechains, but from your DAW of choice, route your kick as a sidechain into either compressor or in this case a dynamic EQ. This dynamic EQ is going to allow me to just duck the low end of this bass so I can keep all the high end good slappiness. Because this is a slap bass, it has quite a bit of high end, all that high end pluck. We want to keep that. The only really big conflicting parts here with amplitude are going to be the low end content. So I'll just do a dynamic EQ, lower the threshold until I can see some movement. Pretty broad area here. As the kick happens, we're going to say it's the kick's job to be the low end content, and everywhere else then the bass can have its low frequency. Notice how much sharper that made the bass. As I compare A and B, here's it with it off. Both the kick and the bass became more forward because they're no longer fighting each other. The third thing I usually like to do, we'll do more with this bass later, but let's start getting our instruments with their basic sort of chains set up. So we have a snare here. Let me make sure this is normalized. Yes, it is. All right. Kick, bass, and snare. Here's a classic dilemma. We have 4 on the floor, and our kick and our snare hit at the same time. But we want our snare to be loud, and we want our kick to be loud. How on earth are we going to get both of these things loud at the same time. The kick's already at maximum amplitude. How on earth can we add a snare to it that wants to be just another big loud transient at the exact moment? Well, here's a fancy little trick. That is, yes, Nordson, cut the transient of the snare to a degree. This snare doesn't have a crazy high spike, but we can work with limiting it. One of the straightforward things to do that's kind of less intrusive to the overall sound, I like to work with broad strokes and then we'll get more fine, is let's go ahead and put the kick and the snare into a drum bus. So I'll create a bus for these channels. You would route this into just these two sounds into an audio channel and make sure you unroute from the master depending on your DAW. How you route things into busing will depend on your DAW, so definitely look into that. It's a very useful tool. It's not just for organization, because now I can control these sounds together. This is where I put my first clipper. Hard clipper. I'm using the Kilohertz. It's a free plugin. It's just a simple hard clipper. Also name this bus my drum bus. Now let's look at the output of our snares going through that drum bus and our kick is going through that drum bus. I'll first turn off the clipper so we can hear what it's like regularly. Right, we've got a kick and a snare that's really not super audible. Uh-oh. That's a third person. I've heard stages have been having issues. Try restarting Discord and rejoining. And make sure that you've got my volume on, of course. And not just stream volume. Make sure you're checking independently the stream volume and mic volume. Those are different levels in Discord. All right, here's it with the clipper off. All right, we got a kick and a little bit of snare coming through. But we're losing some energy because, note that when that snare hits to our master, we're losing some to gain reduction on the limiter. We're asking it to go above 1. We're going to say, let's keep it directly at 1 by clipping the sum of the kick and the snare together to where when the snare hits with the kick, it's not allowed to go above 1. Let's see what that sounds like. Limiter's working less. Now we can probably turn up that snare. Whoa. What just happened? We just turned up the snare. Let's turn off that clipper and see what that sounds like. Alright, we've got a kick and snare, but with the clipper on, that's got way more punch because it adds saturation across the frequency spectrum. And now also, we don't really have to worry about the output of our kick and snare being anything that the master can't handle. We know it's at pretty much unity output. Let's see how much we can turn up the snare. That's a very, very full snare. To even turn this up even more, we can now start looking at clipping the snare. This will add its own character. So now we're going to a clipped snare summing with a kick. So I throw a clipper onto the snare track. Let's increase the input gain. Now that's a bit too crunchy, but believe it or not, this is still hitting all the same audio levels. The exact same amplitude is being produced here from all sounds. We've not increased the actual volume of everything. Remember, anything that tries to go above 0 just gets chopped off. We get a little bit of added, maybe a 0.3 decibels of added volume from harmonics and amplitude, but for the most part, this is 95% the actual same signal level. this is obviously way too much for the snare. Let's turn it down. Now there is quite a punchy snare alongside a kick. This will be important later because this has a lot of instruments playing, so we know that we're probably going to have some difficulty getting the snare to pop through. We'll adjust this later. It's probably a little bit too loud right now. I'll turn it down to about -4 decibels as where it was, and we'll just adjust as things go on. Let's start adding some other instruments. How about those drum percussions? Those perk loops. I'll do the same thing and go ahead and send it to the drum bus. This is going to ensure that none of our weird, because if you note, this has a lot of little spiky transients, and this is one thing that we can immediately look at for, is that we don't need all this transient. We can safely remove a good, like, 50% of that transient just to get some headroom, and there's going to be no audible difference. Once we start removing more than about 50%, there will be audible difference, but it can be in a good way. Let's go ahead, throw a clipper on this, and see. See, we don't need those peaks. I'll, instead of turning this up, I'll drop the level of this clipper, the threshold, down to about -3 decibels to just chop off those little peaks. Notice that it didn't change the sound at all. However, our signal strength is now consistently much lower. If we look at our level, we're getting very high peaks that aren't contributing to the sound. In this case, we can just chop those off. The amount of chopping off you do is completely up to you. Chopping off a decent amount of the peak will just help bring everything up and more forward. If you get into heavy clipping, then we'll start changing the sound, and it'll be more of a stylistic choice. Let me solo this. We can hear some crunch, but kind of a little bit of crunch can be useful, because this is now adding saturation to this part. Chopping off the top of those little hi-hat hits has no audible difference. It's only until we start getting to the meat of it. So a lot of the time, if you're having trouble getting things turned up, and this is not even just very loud and worry, but this can also be used, as I will show you, with light instruments that are plucky. Glockenspiel. This glockenspiel is a particular sort of element that we'll get to, that you'll see why this is extremely powerful. Because there'd be no other way to turn up the glockenspiel otherwise. All right, let's balance that little percussion loop with our kick and our snare. Probably can come up a little bit. And we can now safely do that, because look at all this extra room that we have. Turn it up 3 decibels and throw an EQ on it now that we're working with it. You can do EQ before clipper or after. In the case that you want to just remove any low frequency sort of mud or content from a sound, you can go ahead and just high pass it and then throw it into the clipper. That's going to make sure that the clipper is only getting the signal that you want to clip and not making harmonics from like a low frequency drone or anything. Okay, so this perk loop has a kick built in, but we don't need that kick. We have a kick of our own. So let's go ahead and high pass it anyway. We'll keep a smidge of that extra snare in, but we do have a snare of our own. This will just add a little bit of texture to our other layered snare. Definitely lost a little something here, so let's move that back. I like to keep it just barely overlapping with our other snare here. This is now giving pretty good fullness, but we're still extremely tight and punchy. Let's look at that hi-hat. I'll go ahead and just start throwing EQs on everything as we get to them. Solo it. Hi-hat, we don't need any low frequency information here. Fairly bright. You can look at the waveform first, or we can just use our ears. We see, this will be an issue, especially now that this is a full loop. That little transient there is something that we can safely get rid of. And we'll instead replace it with harmonics. Bring this down just barely. And route this as well into our drum bus. Don't worry, this is going to do a very cool thing when we solo our drum bus after we clip all these individual elements and get them under control. Let's go ahead and add in our other perk loop and our kick and snare to balance this. Hi-hat's a little bit too loud. Let's turn down 2 decibels. This is probably a little bit too low. Sounds like a good starting point. Right. Let's see what rolled up tight topper 1. Another percussion loop. This also has some low, not tons of low, but some mid and mid-low frequency information that we just don't really need. We're going to have instruments down there as our instrumental, and we also have the kick and snare that's going to be doing that job. We have more space to mix, essentially. With the higher the frequency we go, the less things conflict with each other. But anywhere below 1 kilohertz starts to get really touchy, and then anything around 200 hertz, you have to control explicitly and very intentionally. Do our same good old clipping. And these are more textural elements. If there was less going on, I would keep more of these transients. But because we have multiple percussive layers, and remember, we've got these funky guitars going on top of this as well. We're going to say that we want kind of, in order to get these hi-hats to even be audible without having to be way too hot for their transients, we're going to instead focus on having them be a little bit more sustained and saturated, which is what clipping is going to do. If you don't like the sound of hard clipping, this also has a knee function, which will act like a soft clipper. If you throw a soft clipper on pretty much every track and then set the knee to max, you can emulate kind of an analog tape saturation. It won't be exactly, but you'll get sort of a similar saturation in the warmth if you mix like this. I'm going more of an electronic route. We'll see about adding some warmth to it after the fact. Right now, we're kind of just working on signal level and control. Go shave off a good amount of those peaks. Right, let's listen to, send these guys to the drum bus as well. So there's pretty much our drum stack completed. Let's hear how these sound all together. So I'll solo the drum bus. Not bad, not bad. This hi-hat might come down a little bit. Where's our ride cymbal? Uh-oh, I've lost the ride cymbal. I think it's in perk 2. Yep. We have a couple of them. There we go. Let's listen to those drums, and now we can start adding in other elements, and we'll start hearing some music. And the best part of this, despite how much louder we just made all this, this end limiter is doing 1 decibel gain reduction just from the peaks of the harmonics. Now, if I were to turn off all these plugins and instead just have the limiter, let's hear how this sounds like with the same instruments. Just limited. This is just limiting. Go back to clipping. Notice how much forward it brought the transients. That's one of the key utilities of clipping is saturation on those transient spikes. It can help drums cut through what would otherwise be an extremely dense and busy mix without having to subtract from other elements of the mix so much. I would not recommend this style for like smooth jazz, but you can work in it very carefully, so long as you essentially, what we're pushing here, if you push everything just less hard, this will still work because it's a lot of signal level control. All right, bass. I'm going to go ahead and copy over this EQ. This will be setting up the same exact dynamic EQ that we have on this other bass. Let me make sure I'm not, there we go. Because they're both bass tones, and we want the bass to duck with the kick. What I just did here, just routed the exact same EQ that we had for the dynamic EQ, ducking the low end of the bass whenever the kick happens onto this other slappy bass part as well. Let's hear the bass with the drums. Now with nothing, no attenuation, no processing. Me clicking this little button here turns off all the processing for quick ABs to make sure what we've done is actually an improvement, and I do believe so. That bass gets a little bit more forward, our drums get punchier. We might boost a little bit of the low end on this bass, I think. We'll subtract it and make sure our range for our dynamic EQ is no longer being affected. Let's see. There we go. That's a good spot. Let's go ahead and add the next instrument. This can be anything. Any votes in the chat for what instrument we should add next? Now we've got past the hard to control things. Now it's going to be all the layers. We've got our bass roughly sorted. As much as I'd like to get it right now until we start adding other instruments, we don't know to do like any sort of high shelf or anything here because we don't know if it's cutting through enough by itself when we layer everything else. Mixing very much is a sort of few simple things to start to kick off with, especially drum processing. That kind of tends to be just leveling. We can get a good drum bus. Then we add our bass part. Everything else after that is going to be a lot of seeing how they work together. Every song is going to be its own unique puzzle to solve. This matters both with rhythm and arrangement and even tempo. Consider how if we have a long sustain on our kick for the sub bass content, like a techno kick, if we were to have a fast song with that, the kick of the sustain of the kick wouldn't be done potentially by the time the next kick happens. This thankfully has plenty of space. We can see plenty of room between kicks, so this sustain is not an issue. Well, let's see. How about we go piano. Piano's already an important one to work with, so let's keep our bass and just layer in our piano. Let's see. Let's go ahead and throw an EQ on the piano. And let's see, this sounds a little bit hot as is. do a little bit of reduction of the low end here. Again, we don't need around the 100 hertz for the piano. We don't want to remove all the life for around the 200 hertz region, but we will subtract it. You could do either high pass accompanied with a high shelf, or if you want a little bit more rougher, more kind of analog sounding mixing style, just do a low shelf for the piano. It doesn't have a lot of low frequency content, but for the case of electronic style like this J-pop stuff, it can be good to just do a high pass on it. We'll adjust the specifics of this curve once we get more instruments layered in. Because goodness, one thing that we do know is that we have two pianos happening at the same time. Throw an EQ on this second piano. Let's hear what this sounds like. Right. Now let's see how these work together, or specifically probably don't work together. You hear that build up sort of in the mid frequencies, low mids, right around the 250, 300 hertz range. That is because we've got two pianos playing at the same time there. So one thing I do first on the second piano is this does have, it's playing lower notes. We'll keep some of that, but I'll high pass it just the same as the other one. Keep just a little bit of that, but we can have less. I'm going to do a tighter curve just to cut off stuff that's below the 200 hertz a little bit more aggressively. Probably turn down the volume a little bit. Our bass kind of gets buried under the piano as well. Not the low frequency content, but all that good slappiness. So the first thing I'm going to do is, okay, we've got two pianos. We have two of anything. It's a good idea to start looking at stereo panning. Let's move this 50% to the left and the other one 50% to the right. Now those instruments are very separated. We can tell there's two pianos happening. Let's see, that piano sounds like this lower one here on the left could have a little bit of reduction in these sort of 300 to 500 hertz range. Let's see if that cleaned it up a little bit. Let's do a little bit of a high shelf, a little bell curve. Maybe a little bit less panning. We'll keep it slightly more center for the left piano. Yeah, clipping, as Nordson says, adds specifically odd harmonics that are kind of felt as noise by rounding off waveforms. Having a very aggressive limiter does this, but a clipper works even faster than most limiters do, and will add harmonics and saturation to a sound. It's not good. I will say this outright. Clipping, careful with using it on melodic sounds. The little transients of, say, a plucky bass guitar, fine to clip, but if we start getting into clipping the main signal, the sustained notes of, like, say, a bass guitar, it's going to start sounding very rough and very crunchy. Now, you may like that sound, but from my experience, clipping a piano, for example, sounds terrible. Let's see, I think we can turn down our hi-hats a little bit now that we've got some pianos in the loop. Okay, we're starting to get some music here. Yes, that's a good point that Nordson brings up. Definitely experiment with, as you add clipping or distortion, any sort of distortion, throw an EQ or a spectrum analyzer after that sound and see what it's adding, or changing, or reducing. Let's look at our next currently playing. Let's see, we have a steel stringed acoustic guitar virtual instrument. Let's take a listen to this by itself. We hear this has some low frequency content, but we've already got a bass. Same treatment as the piano. We'll keep a little bit of it for some warmth, but we don't need any of that below 100 hertz stuff. Let's go ahead and add this with the pianos and everything else. Guitar's getting kind of buried. Good old classic fix is that we can do a little bit of a high shelf. Careful with getting too bright. Maybe we'll think about panning that to give it some separation later on. Do we have anything else here? We do have strings. Let's add those in. Throw an EQ on them just for good measure. Now these strings have a case of they're perfectly audible when they're at full attack. But look at this here in the center. They bury themselves. We have a case of an instrument getting too loud and then too quiet. This is a classic solution for compression. Draw a simple compressor on that. I'm going to adjust my threshold until I see it start activating on the signal. There we go, we've got some activation. That means that it's reducing the volume. I'll set the attack to as fast as possible for this case. These don't have any transients or anything to preserve. This is going to lower the volume of the higher areas of this and make less difference between the low and highs, which is what we want, because this has an issue right now in the mix, is that it's getting too quiet in the middle parts. We still want to have some dynamics, but it's getting too quiet here, and instead of drawing in automation myself for the volume, that's what a compressor's job is. Ratio is going to be how aggressively it is compressed, so I'll do 3:1. They are strings. Different instruments will have their own sort of compression ratio that works good. Strings, you kind of want to do a soft hand on, unless you're making some crazy experimental electronic stuff. But generally kind of good. The softer the instrument and sort of more sustained, the lighter you can be on compression. We can hear definitely that this has less of a difference between maximum and minimum volume. Let me lower the threshold just 2 more decibels. This is essentially just saying we turn it down when it goes above a certain level, specifically because we want to turn up these middle parts but not turn up the latter parts. 2 more decibels. Now we can start adding makeup gain. Now that we have lowered the peaks of this, just kind of it's same principle kind of as clipping, but less aggressive. Now we can turn up everything so that the low parts are now louder, but the high parts don't get any louder. Aha, now look at that. Our louder parts are now where they were before, but now the low volume areas are now audible again. Notice how the strings just completely disappear here. That sounds a bit funny. And now with compression, we can now hear them again. Maybe it'll be a little bit more aggressive in this case. A bit more ratio and a smidge more makeup gain. Pretty good bass level. Right, I do believe that's all that's playing. Oh, right, we have our... I like to hit the effects as the last thing. Let's listen here. Now we can start working on just this little section, making some improvements to the existing instruments. Bass is a little bit buried. I'll add a compressor, doing the same thing I did with the strings. Oh, I must make sure to put this compressor before our EQ or any sort of ducking compressor. Otherwise, this compressor is going to be trying to turn up, or it's going to be reacting to a modified signal. We want to essentially get this, change our first layer to get this more. That's why I did a high pass with the phasing. We don't really have to worry about phasing too much around the 500 to 1K to especially around 2 kilohertz or higher. That's not going to have any phase issues. Or minimal phase issues. The biggest place for phase issues is going to come from low frequency content. Having a little bit of interaction there can be good. Say if we have like a little bit of 250 or 200 hertz coming through from both pianos, one on the left, one on the right, and we have that coming from our bass, that's going to add a little bit of modulation there, but it's not going to be like moving our peaks, plus or minus 10 decibels from phase cancellations. It's going to be moving our sustained bass note, plus or minus maybe 1 decibel. It gives it some life. Now that we've got a little bit more happening, I think I want to look at this kick and give it a little bit more punch. So now I'm going to start going into clipping on the kick. One of the tools I like to use a lot is the Kilohertz Transient Shaper. This is a useful tool to where now I can specifically, it has a clipping function built in. I can only clip the transient of the kick. I can boost the transient and then only clip that. I don't have to worry about clipping from the other method, because if I just bring down or put the input gain, now we're going to be clipping into the sustained low frequency content, and we don't want that. So let me boost just the transient of this kick to help it punch through a little bit. Another little trick I like to put on acoustic guitars, especially plug-in based ones. Let me go ahead and throw this same compressor on this other bass. There are similar sounds. I also think I'm going to group these two basses into a bus. There we go. Now we have a bass bus. Throw an EQ on this for simple adjustments to the overall tone of the basses as they play. One thing that I definitely would like to add to these basses is some saturation. So I'm going to load up a saturation plugin. This is Red Light District. Any sort of tube amp saturation or even just wave shaper would work in this case. I'm going to create this as a send to the bass track. So now the bass bus is outputting to the saturator, which is going to not affect the transients. Saturators will smear transients, it will butter knife them, and we want to keep the slappiness and the percussiveness of that bass a bit intact rather than completely smear it over. So this is going to add some harmonics to see how hard tube sounds. Ooh, and firstly, let me make sure that I high pass the output of the send, because we don't want the low frequency content feeding back into itself. We're looking to boost kind of the high end and the body of this bass here, or the basses. They're both very similar tones. And now we can adjust how much that's layered in using the fader here. Oops, wrong fader. This fader. Yes, this is parallel. There we go. A little bit of saturation on those basses helps them be thick enough to cut through all those pianos. Now, these pianos are still very full. I think we'll do a little bit more adjustment to them. Let's go ahead and group the pianos together. Make a bus for these pianos. Keep organized. Piano bus. And I'll name this Red Light District Send Bass Saturation. Now we can solo just pianos. Throw an EQ on it. We've got a lot of mids, but I'd like a little bit more high end for the pianos. So another cool trick is using the same thing that we did for the basses. Especially this one. This piano is lacking it's not the fanciest plugin. It's lacking a lot of the high-end harmonics around 10 kilohertz, and we can add those ourselves manually. So to do that, I'm going to go pull up Red Light District again, or any other saturation plugin, throw it as a send for this lower piano track, the one that's playing lower notes. Let's do soft tube. Then we'll go find that. There it is. I'm going to name this piano saturation. EQ it, boom, and we're going to high pass it just to where it's not even overlapping at all with the original signal. Now we're going to drive it really hard into that saturation. Too much. Maybe we'll even try hard tube. I'll put an EQ also to cut out the low content, so we're not feeding low content into the saturator. That'll help clean up the sound. Now this is crunchy by itself, but watch what happens when we add it back to our original signal. High shelf. There we go. We've got some crispy air on this. Doesn't sound great by itself, but when we add back in that piano, when we add back in the piano, where's our original signal? Hold on. Have I broken something? What's going on here? Main, bus. Okay, there's our piano. EQ'd and everything. Let's do a little bit less. Up the distortion, lower the drive. There we go, that's the cleaner tone. And now, can very quietly layer in a little bit of high-end saturation. There we go. I think I'll turn this one down a little bit. There we go. Let's start adding, let's see, we got our strings. Let's hear what it is all together. Ooh, risers are low. Let's go ahead and sort those now. All the effects are way too loud. Lower the cymbal. We know this is way too loud. Drums are actually not bad there. All these 3 stacks of crashes, though. Get a bit much. Alright, now let's start looking at getting into the other words. Actually, I'd like to do one little thing to this acoustic guitar, and that's going to just be throwing a little bit of saturation on it as well. That's a common thing you'll see, but especially it's good for high-end of pianos if they're lacking high-end, and helping a acoustic guitar, especially these virtual instrument-based ones, feel a little bit more lively and full. Just a little bit of hard tube, very lightly driven. This could be directly on the channel itself. Let's see. Let's see how this is. Ooh, not there. Here. Right, now let's start looking at these synths. Actually, the glockenspiel. I can get into clipping on a melodic instrument. So let's look at what this glockenspiel signal looks like. Oh boy. That's a very sharp and bright transient on that. That really isn't contributing a whole lot to the sound, especially we've already got drums, and this is certainly not soloed. Let's hear this glockenspiel attempt to cut through the rest of our percussive stuff. Transient sounds too loud here. Let's turn it down. We run into the issue of where that glockenspiel, when turned up loud enough to hear the sustains good, is a bit too loud, but when turned down too much, gets buried. And the big culprit here are the super bright transients. This is where I'll do a little bit of knee and just barely there we go. That reduced quite the bright, sort of piercy pluckiness of it when turned up. Let's look at that synth melody here as well. Oh boy, we can hear there's a lot of mids in that synth. Our EQ is probably going to back this up. Yeah, tons of 500 hertz. The very first thing that we can hear is needs to just come down in volume a good bit. It's a lead melody, so it should probably be sitting a little bit higher than our rhythmic acoustic guitar and our chords. But this has the point where it has so much 500 hertz that in order to get this forward enough, it's too loud in 500 hertz, but turning it down too much is also making it not feel as forward as it needs to be. This is not sounding like a primary element. Simple thing of what I like to do here is let's just turn down the fundamental a little bit, and we'll boost the high end. There we go. That's much better. Off. On. Brought it forward without way over boosting the 500 hertz region, because if we were to just turn it up, it would be a little bit uncomfortable there. Let's start looking at those funky guitars. Go ahead and throw an EQ on them. I'm sure we'll be changing some stuff. And the clavinet. Alright, let's hear this funky guitar. Ooh, a little bit sharp around the 2 kilohertz. You don't want to kill all the life from it, but let's just reduce that resonance just a little bit, just a little peak there. Hear that clavinet? Same deal. And we know these are going to be playing together, so if one was already a little bit too sharp in the 2 kilohertz region, 2 of them playing at the same time, probably going to be way too sharp. Way too harsh. Here's a classic case of we've got one playing the same and another instrument playing also the same. Let's go ahead and pan these stereo. Boom, left. How about you right? Stereo width does change how we perceive loudness as well. Things pan stereo will just sound louder even through no signal change. Also a good thing to exploit as well though. Panning will increase our perceived loudness. Thus we don't need to rely on just purely turning up the amplitude of the signal. These probably can both come down a little bit though. We'll get them balanced with each other so that they're not fighting with each other around sort of the same volume or same perceived loudness to each other. See how this is working out with our lead melody here. I come down a little bit more. And our glockenspiel. Alright, not bad. Let's add in that guitar and see if anything conflicts. Maybe the one on the left can come up a little bit. That's better. Notice that we can hear currently every single instrument clearly. Let's add that big piano. We know that's quite full, so we might run into some issues here. Piano's a little bit indistinct. Probably can bring down the guitar just a little bit. Maybe we'll pan the guitar a little bit to the right. There we go. Everything all together. I think a little bit would like a little bit of a high-end boost on the snare. Let's go ahead and trim the low frequency content out of it. Boosting and changing the fundamental of a snare is a good way to shape its tone. Notice that's obviously way too much and it sounds all weird and boxy and hollow. But we can remove the tone of a snare by having a sharp, high Q attenuation right at the fundamental, which is going to be generally a snare. A real snare will have a obvious spike somewhere around 110 to like 200 hertz. Electronic snares and post-process things can have the case where they don't even have any fundamental, but that's also how they are made, is if you take a real snare sample, remove most of the fundamental, boost up mids, high end, boom, now we have an electronic snare that lacks tone, is mostly kind of just a burst of noise. In this case, definitely we're going to keep our fundamental. I just would like a little bit higher air and crispiness on this snare. Clean up a little bit around the 200 hertz. Ooh, let's sort that as we heard it. What on earth was so loud? Reverb snare. Yeah, let's just turn that down. Good trick for going into drops is make sure that the build up to the drop, for the most part, is not louder than the accompanying drop right after. We want to go up in energy if we have a riser or some section that is way louder before it, then it feels weird when we go from super loud to a little bit less loud. It's supposed to be a buildup of energy. We can't go from like a stair step down right after in just a brief moment. We always want it to be slightly just under the volume of the next section, or even greater differences. Just a general rule: don't have it be louder than, don't have the buildup and all your snares and riser effects unless it's very intentional be louder than what's supposed to be the chorus of the song. Because we have our intro here, and then boom, all the instruments start playing, and we get our main lead. Let's see that we can do some cleanup a little bit, but now we're about halfway through all the instruments. We do have this electric guitar, so let's go to that area. 2 electric guitars. All right, EQ on this one. Ooh, very full. Don't need the low end. Again, we have multiple instruments playing a little bit of low end here. We have how many? Count them. Electric bass, an acoustic guitar. We have a piano or multiple, and we have our kick. There's at least 4 things that are now playing a little bit into the low mids and getting into the bass frequency content area. Thus, we'll kind of keep the balance by knowing that this is going to be a sum. The master is going to have a sum of all of these elements. So we'll cut them a little bit early. And then we can always, the good thing is that we can always choose something later. We can make it a little bit sterile at first, and then we can go back and say, you know what, I think I can get away with a little bit of extra, say, on probably this crispy electric guitar is going to be a good contender for what we want to be at that sort of warmth in the 200 hertz area. probably just turn this down, though. It's very full and very loud. This little guitar sounds great. Good tone. Let's see, any shaping we like to do here? No, it doesn't seem too harsh or anything. This just needs to be panned. And sometimes, yeah, you'll definitely run into the instruments that you don't really need to do hardly anything to. Let's see. Let's listen to the overall mix and make sure we get some separation in the panning. Does this feel better left or right? I think I like it right more. Let's see. Let's consider some of the use cases of the instruments. We have the big piano chords playing on the left. You have power chords from this guitar playing on the right. Let's go ahead and throw this electric guitar a little bit right to balance out the piano on the left. See how that sounds. In fact, let's go ahead and throw this acoustic guitar that we had on the right now a little bit left. The idea here is we kind of want to keep a balance of frequencies across the stereo field. We don't want all of our high end being on the right side and say all of our low end or lower frequency content on the left side. Though that can be cool as a creative effect, for general purpose mixing, we kind of want to seek when we are panning stuff to, especially with multiple layers, is look at things that are doing some common like chords and sort of rough note areas. So this is playing stuff probably 1 octave above our bass in some cases, and is very full, and is doing lots of our sort of warmth and lower chords and such. It's very full, and we have another piano that's playing a similar part. And thus we know, okay, if we have these both on the same sort of panning area, then they'll both be a little bit too much. But if we split them one left, one right, we can balance them to each other, and then we get a very full, warm piano on our left side, a very full, warm electric guitar on the other side, and it balances out the stereo field. But we keep these instruments also still separate. A little bit down in volume. This piano can probably come back up. Still a little bit more of a high-end boost. Let's increase that saturation just a smidge. Problem. Okay, let's lead. Simply, we'll turn it down. This is not great sound selection, in my opinion. Low end cut. This will probably be mostly volume. Let's do a little bit of panning on these leads. We know we have 3 that are going to be stacked over here. We'll probably, since we have this lead guitar here on the right, let's go ahead and pan this guy a little bit left. Let's listen to the next incoming melody as well. Ooh. Again, a lot of that 500 hertz. Attenuate, attenuate. See, we have 3 elements here, so let's mess with getting all these to be a cool stereo effect. Ooh, they get a little bit bright and painful going up on that scale. I'm going to go ahead and group all these together in a bus. We know that when they sum, they get way too bright and almost painful. up around the 2 kilohertz region. That's that very high end. We'll see it on the EQ as we look here. Yeah, look at this all around here. Let me solo this band. Ow. Listen as they go up their scale and continue their melody, that they get painful. Ooh, ugh, right there. Ow. Ow. Let's, simplest solution there is classic. Let's just cut a little bit so it'll be perceived as even. Human hearing is more sensitive to around 2 kilohertz, 3 kilohertz. Thus, that's why they're so bright there. We can solve that by just kind of manually balancing a few decibels down by ear until it sounds like the high frequency content is just as loud as the lower frequency stuff, or the sort of mids. There we go, and just a universal cut. It does not have a delta, no, Studio One does not have a delta button. So you can't just turn on and off. So presumably you could always just make your own delta channel by running another parallel signal and then phase inverting that from the original. Right, we know these are probably going to be touchy. These are some very interesting sounding synths. Let's see how they play with the other instruments. Alright, the guitar is happy with them. How about this one? Ooh, we've not touched this one yet. Another twangy electric guitar. That's why this is a great mix example. We've got a lot of instruments doing different things. Just set the level at first. Just listen through, and then when that guitar inevitably gets too loud, we'll just turn it down. Ooh, we have an electric piano here. Let's give this bad boy some love. Let's see, we've got more space. We only have the electric bass. Let's keep, because this electric piano only exists right here. Let's give this, we'll still do a high cut, but we're going to be sharper about it to keep a lot of those 200 hertz. That's going to be a lot of the warmth and the sort of texture of it. Maybe a little bit of high boost, just a smidge around 2 kilohertz. We also have more strings here. Cut a little bit from the low end there as well. We've got both electric piano and our still regular bass playing here. We're going to say the bass's job is going to be our bass part. That's going to be its part. And thus it'll always win over. So we'll just cut it from these strings. And they only occur here, so it's not like there's ever a solo section. If there were to be a section where it was just solo strings, then what I generally do is just make another track and then not apply the EQ. Or you could apply automation and just turn off the EQ or change where the slope is and just move it all the way to the left or something. Or you will reduce it and process that section differently. I personally like to process by section by their intended use so that it's easy to organize. I'll know I have strings that have their low frequency content, and then I'll mentally organize it as, here's a section with solo strings. Those will be the solo strings rather than the supporting strings, like in this case. Maybe we can do a little bit of air on these. Lower the volume a smidge. Let's turn down those chimes. Okay, guitar. First off the bat, too loud. Turn it down. Yoink. I've mixed this song before, but this is the hardest section because we have literally pretty much every single instrument playing here. This is our second chorus. We have our melodies, we have our acoustic, we have a twangy, rich guitar, we have our strings coming back, which are a very difficult thing to mix in with all of this. We have a full piano, another plucky guitar. Have we touched this one yet? I don't think we even have. Not hearing a lot here, just going to be some panning, I think. Let's put it to the left. I like that glockenspiel to be a little bit more forward. Let's do a little bit harsher clipping. And turn it up just a smidge. Probably can pan this a little bit. I'd like a little bit more bass out of our basses. Let's go ahead and boost them subtly in the low end. Where's our bass bus? There it is. Let's do a low shelf. Right, we're gonna have to make some solutions here. This guy needs to move probably left. We've got a lot of high information and high stuff on the right. We've got a little bit of space on the left. Kill a lot of lows. We're gonna be more aggressive with this guy. We're running out of kind of space here. So we're gonna have to be more aggressive with our EQ decisions. Try to take a little bit from the mids. See how that works out. Let's turn down those other melodies. This one's fine by itself. When they add together. One way that we can get more consistent volume when we have an additional adding of layers is these are all into a bus. I've got them in bus 1. Let me name this as melody bus. We put a compressor on that. That's going to ensure that even when they add all together, we're gonna start to see some attenuation of their overall loudness, so that we don't have to worry about changing the mix with automation or anything. We got a compressor to be a watchdog over them and say, melody should never, regardless of how many layers there are, they should never exceed, say, a certain threshold. Start just dialing this down until the melodies are no longer absolutely peaking over everything else. Dark electronic so we can do a hard knee. That's better. And now our solo melody didn't get quite so affected. a little bit of sort of high-end fatigue in the left side now. Let's reduce this a bit. We'd probably instead try to keep a little bit more of the low mids for this guy. Pan the guitar a little bit more. Maybe put this one a little bit more center. You might have to be, unfortunately, relegated to a subtle support role. Sounds good on the right side. What's this little effect? Oh, let's put that in our risers. Oh, we don't need this track. This is just a sidechain trigger that was in the original. So one thing is, I think we can put our strings, now that we've touched pretty much every instrument now, I think we can start working on getting the refinement between all of them. We've done our first pass, now we can get into the nitty-gritty. And now I'll also start throwing secret weapon, the clipper on the master. We haven't been driving it too hard, but we can see here. We can also just adjust the input gain for our desired loudness. Let's see how this sounds now. Notice that we're getting clipping only on the transients of our drums, our kick and snare really. Compare that to where if we were pushing too hard and getting clipping well into the rest of the signal. Very obviously squashed too hard. Whereas where we are at now, it's just the peaks of the transients from the drum bus summing together. And the drum bus is already controlled with clipping, so we're just getting the saturation and the harmonics of the drum bus spiking in the master at just the very brief moment in time. The cool effect this has is, watch as I turn it on and off, how magically it pulls the entire drum track forward. That snare gets really tight and snappy. As is right here, it's kind of a little bit still sort of turn on the clipper on the master. It gets that nice sort of little click to it. This will often accompany when you add the clipper to your master. You'll likely need to go back and volume balance a few things, especially in the drum bus. If you were working to try to get the snare good before the clipper on the master, you might find that when you go ahead and put the clipper on the master, the snare becomes frankly too loud. Like it'll be, oh, this is obviously way too forward. The simple solution to that is just turn down the fader on the snare. It's going to be simple volume adjustments because we've preserved all of our saturation from the clipping that we already have earlier down the line. We're not going to lose any of that saturation on our snare sound itself. We're not going to be changing the tone of the snare. It's just going to be changing the loudness of that tone. And that's the big one, is that this setup We've essentially set it to where the faders are just controlling the loudness of the sound. It's not adjusting how hard we're pushing the clippers except on the end of the master, which the only thing the master is going to do in this case when pushed with drum transients is make them sound louder and give them more of a forwardness in general. Like if I just want to turn down the snare, all I need to do is turn down the snare. Now we have a couple snares, because remember we have that other drum percussion loop. But now we've got good snare control. And in many cases, I find that I usually tend to turn down the snare. You'll get it. I recommend setting it good with the first 2 levels of clipping the snare a little bit, if you'd like, or at least clipping on the drum bus. And then when we add the clipper to the master, then you'll see whether or not you want to bring it more forward or less, depending on the genre you're going for. Different genres are just own personal taste and preference. You'll have your snare at different levels. The one thing is just that you can have it very fairly relaxed, or you can bring it really forward. That's too forward, but that's 10 decibels of gain. We don't need that much. Right around here seems pretty good. It's not distracting, but it's still nice and punchy. One thing I'll note is around this area, it sounds a little bit thin in our kind of low mids. That's to be expected. We cut a lot of them there, so now it's time to choose something to win. One of the things that I think plays the most during all this track is going to be that piano. So let's start adding a little bit of the low mids back to the big fuller piano on our left here. We'll scooch this over just a smidge and get rid of this reduction here. A lot of it is setting up things that you know might conflict early on, and then I'll have to do 3 passes. It'll be a first pass. I'm just setting up signal control, knowing that, okay, if we have loud sounds or loud punchy transients, let's get these attenuated early and controlled and get some basis for saturation. We'll do some basic tone shaping, but simple stuff. Probably just a high boost here and there, maybe a little bit of cut around the mids. And then setting rough approximate levels with the faders, and then we'll go in second pass of getting, okay, let's get this sounding very full, but also very clean. Maybe this a little bit more center. One thing definitely on this melody, and this is very much halfway a creative decision and the other half a mixing decision, is I think this melody should exist in a little bit of a space. So I'm going to put a reverb on it. Just a little bit of reverb, just to help give it a little bit of separation from everything else. It's kind of weird and forward everything else being more traditional instrumentation, even if virtual. So all of a sudden we have a very, very synthesized and artificial synth lead coming in. Let's see if we can't give that a little bit more naturalness to it. This will also help give it a little bit more dispersion in the stereo field, especially depending on the reverb you use. Convolution will work here just as plate would as well. In this case, I'm just putting it directly on the sound. There's no transients preserved. This is a simple sound, thus you can just throw the reverb directly on the channel. There's not really a lot of information to preserve here. It's 3. This has 3 whole harmonics, or fundamental, an octave, and then I think a fifth as just a rounded sine wave, or sorry, rounded square. Let's see, it's sounding pretty good. One way is that we can get a little bit more out of the basses as well. Let's increase that bass saturation just a smidge. Let's emphasize the sort of 500 Hz region. It's going to be subtle, but it'll be all those little subtle things that give something life. There we go. This will probably work out much more full. Oh yes, hear that bass now. Listen to what the fader brings in. So this is my parallel send of just saturation with a mostly high pass. Again, I just want to avoid phase issues with the actual sub content around 100 Hertz from the original bass sound. Saturators can adjust phase and things, and simply I don't need any more low-end content. I've controlled that by itself on the bass track and then on the bass bus. I don't need another thing bringing in more low-end. I don't need any more sub, and I don't need any more actual bass, ironically, to this bass. I want to make this bass feel more bassy by increasing the low mids. And we'll saturate the ever-living crap out of them with a saturator. Actually, this is too hard, but hard tube. Tube saturation works good. A lot of even harmonics there, which are musical. Odd harmonics sound like noise. Both have their places, but we want to keep it musical for this bass. We want it to cut through more, and thus, watch as I bring in this fader. This is just mixing into the overall, not even go to the bass bus, just adding to the master channel, a big accent around the 500 Hertz part of a saturated bass signal that has had the low end removed. So this just sounds alone like this. We're adding this sound to this bass, which is here. We'll adjust that in as it's playing. A lot of sounds by themselves will be kind of funny sounding. And we go a little bit more aggressive with the distortion. Another thing is that little high boost I did, I might retract now that the snare. Another thing with clipping is that it does add high order odd harmonics, and that will sort of just scale all the way up the frequency chart. So it's a good way to add harmonics that are directly related to the original sound that are now high frequency. But it also does, if you clip too much, especially on the drum bus, you just have to be careful that you'll run up with a buildup where you get a lot of high end. Like above 10 kilohertz stuff, and that can start to sound piercing. So the things that you're like, oh, the snare needs a little bit more high end. Once you go ahead and put that clipper on the master, because now remember this clipper on the end sees the whole instrumental, and as a little sort of visual check, so you don't have to use your ears. Just getting the little peaks of rhythmic stuff. We just want to make sure that when we are mixing, I've actually ended up in a very good spot as is, we don't end up with our sustained signals. It's okay to see little tiny peaks pop into the clipper for their master channel, especially this is no drums on, this is just the chugs of the guitar and the glockenspiels and everything. That's okay. A guitar pluck is not tonal. It's just a noise, as well as a little attack of a glockenspiel. All the ways that these are synthesized is you literally it's white noise samples that play for 5 or 10 milliseconds, and then the tone comes in. That's okay to have noise in. It'll make them feel more forward and give them some little rhythmic pop. We just want to make sure that we're not running into an issue of this, where we can now very clearly hear we're running into our sustained tonal signals, and this is a whole frequency spectrum that's now getting potentially clipped. If I throw an EQ on this, we can see an EQ before and EQ after. Obviously crunchy here. All of our levels post clipper are just like a decibel higher, especially on the high end, and that's just because we're getting now rather than a little tiny burst of saturation, we're now saturating pretty much constantly. You can do this if you want sort of a fullness to your master, is very subtly get it kind of high and then add a little bit of knee. This is now going to be less aggressive with the clipping and more of a soft clipper. This will turn it into a soft clipper, and soft clipping adds less extra highs and it's just more gentle in sound and is a good common way to get, if you have a track that's mixed good and you don't feel like adding saturation to individual instruments, or you're just worried that you're going to change the balance, you can keep the tonal balance of the track and add just a little bit of soft clipping that's just barely touching it, and that will add a whole lot of fullness. In this case, I don't think we need it. We're sorting that on the track side. There's multiple layers that you could do this in. You could either just add saturation to a lot of the tracks you think would benefit from it and get absolute control, or you say, yeah, good enough, and throw a little bit of a soft clipper on the master, and work with it like that. And also, this is a very good utility, because if you ever realize that, like, uh-oh, you're running too hot, you can just adjust the input gain. Boom, and now it's all worked out. But in this case, we're at a good level from the get-go. You might see what's peaking those little things there. Probably the glockenspiel. Yeah. Ooh, and also a few little strums on the guitar, but that's fine. Let's think about how we can clean this up just a little bit more. It's not bad at all, but there's a little bit of extra magic that we can work on it. These guys can probably be separated more. Let's throw one all the way left and the other one all the way right. This is gonna be weird when it's solo though, isn't it? Yeah, okay. Not fully stereo then. Now we can start adjusting our crashes and things too. They might come up. This one can come down. A little bit less there as well. Let's see this. Not bad. I might start adding a little bit of reverb to some things. Right here, we run into a little bit of an issue of buildup on like 3 kilohertz. Might clean up the hi-hats a little bit. Perk loops are adding just a little bit to the noise. One thing, I might separate these slightly in the stereo field. Just a smidge, only like 20 or 30% left or right. There we go, that adds some nice space in the hi-hats. strings should actually probably be a little bit more center. Up in volume 1 decibel. Let's boost that little roll there. Is it here? Let's cut a little bit from these guys. There we are. Bass is coming through loud and clear. We've got a little bit of ambiguity on the left and right. Now, it won't be possible to get a perfect mix. It's always good to have the instruments will interact a little bit. So depending on how much clarity you need, because a lot of them are just kind of supporting each other and being very full, as is in a lot of the J-pop style. They'll layer. It comes from a little bit known as the wall of sound level of compositions, where we have multiple things playing the same parts. Like a piano also playing along with a guitar or with an electric guitar, all doing the exact same rhythmic structure and chords, and they're meant to just kind of blend together a bit. The guitar, I think we could boost a little bit more at the high end, though. This acoustic guitar is going to be, I think, the thing that we modify the most, at least with stereo panning. We might just try auditioning it in different stereo locations. And just as a reference, here's it with no processing. And just a limiter. And here's our improvements. I'll go, here's nothing. Let's go the full area, there we go. Here's nothing on. A bit flat. And I'll play it, and then I'll turn on all the processing. Much more depth. Let's see, we might have a little bit extra sauce in the sort of 1 kilohertz range, though. What instrument do we think would be good for that? Maybe, let's see, we might use the acoustic guitar for that purpose. It's very warm there. Let's increase this back up. Maybe increase the saturation just a smidge. I'd like to scoop a little bit of the mids out of the kick, just for personal preference. Yeah, that's better. Maybe a little bit of boost to the low end. I use one more thing with low mids. Bring the cutoff down a little bit. Where's our other sound over here? This guy can probably come up a bit. Let's actually add a compressor to this guitar. It's getting a little bit buried, but this is like, just note that the more stuff you layer, the harder it is going to get everything super clean. You can do a lot with compression, but it will get to the point of it's not infinite. There's a limit to things, and I recommend experimenting with arrangements to see just how many things you can get away with at once. This is a good example of just about the limit. The classical rule is 5 elements. You'll have your drums, chords, bass, vocal, and a lead. In this case, we have like, how many are playing at once? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. We'll keep drums 1. We've got like 10 things happening at once here. The ratio, let's see if we can't just get this guitar more audible. We're going to remove a little bit of the pluckiness from it. There it is, buried. Let's see, where are we going to put him? Seems he fits better on the right side. We also have another one here. Maybe we'll see if we can't swap the positions. Turn this guy up a little. That little right guitar, I think, come up a little. Let's bring this guy down 1 or 2. Getting into the really nitty-gritty little volume adjustments now. Working less on hearing the instruments, more just adjusting to make sure the overall balance, tonal balance of the mix is roughly equal across the stereo field and in the general sense. that was an improvement on the piano side. Let's solo this region. I might add some saturation to the other piano. The one that plays, yeah, more high frequency stuff. This would benefit. Just a little bit. We're going to fake a high end that this piano doesn't have naturally. More bass on that other bass, I think. There we go. Yeah, that's more full. A little bit down on this piano, just 2 decibel. One little down on the guitar. 1 decibel or so. Let's see, these strings could use a little love, I think. maybe a little bit more range on our dynamic EQ for the bass. Down a little bit more on the piano. This one can come up. I add a little bit of reverb on that glockenspiel. Give it some. It's very, very sharp, small tone. It has a lot of amplitude, but not a lot of volume, as I like to think of it as, like domain across the frequency spectrum. So let's give it a little bit of diffusion and give it a little bit more width and body to it. There we go. Where that limiter is really, now that everything's all together, or sorry, that clipper makes such a huge difference in energy. I really think definitely a good tool to use, even across all genres, just so long as it's used carefully and very intentionally. Doing nothing but turning on a limiter, and look how, and it's completely transparent. You can't tell that the clipper's there. It just brings the drums forward. Listen to the position of the snare. Just the limiter is not bad by itself, but that clipper can be just a little thing. Now, of course, always, you just got to be careful that you do take care to, especially with this one, look at the output and see how much it's clipping. Depending on the genre and how loud you want to go, if you're making like hardcore or something, then you can start clipping into the sustained signals, like the melodic content. But for most other genres, you can just have just a little bit of clipping on the peaks of the drums. That's really what you want. I feel like you're getting a little bit of brightness sort of build up around 4 kilohertz just from the sum of everything. Not one instrument has a problem there alone. Just add things together until we start hearing that crop up. Let me put an EQ on. I do have an EQ here. Yeah, we've got a little bit too much around here. I could do just an EQ on the master. I prefer to fix that by changing the instruments themselves, just for finer level control. We can audition to see if it's an improvement here. The 200 hertz region is a very tricky one. A lot of the stuff below 100 hertz is more just signal level control and making sure nothing else is there. 200 hertz has a lot of the body of a mix, but it also contributes to a lot of upwards masking. Upwards masking is the psychoacoustic phenomenon where audio levels of, especially around 200 hertz, but essentially things make it harder to make out what's above them in the frequency spectrum. So 500 hertz bunch of noise is going to make a tone at like 600 hertz much harder to hear, but the opposite is not true. So 500 hertz of noise with a band from 400 to 600 hertz, and we play a 390 hertz tone. That 390 hertz tone is going to be perfectly audible and not masked at all. Masking only really occurs up the frequency spectrum, and that's the psychoacoustic phenomenon of just how our brains expect to perceive harmonics of sound, to where it's just a side effect of our own internal audio processing, that if we have a lot of noise below a certain tone that we want to be clear, it will make the thing that we want to be clear sound harder. This is not linear across the frequency spectrum. It tends to not be an issue at all above 2 kilohertz, but specifically for whatever reason, around 200 hertz, if we have a lot of 200 hertz, it just makes everything else harder to even discern. This is known as the area called mud. Lowering it increases perceived clarity, but also reduces kind of the weight of the mix. It makes it sound hollow. This is super clear. We've got punchy bass. We have clear instrument separation. It just doesn't have any weight to it. Here, we'll just do a simple EQ cut on master. A good thing to listen for also is if you do have solo bands or an EQ that can solo, run through a fairly tight band and see if you can pick apart different instruments in different sections. That's a good check for arrangement. There should be a clear distinction of around 200 to 2 kilohertz being kind of a lot of your chords, 1 kilohertz or 500 to 5 kilohertz being a lot of your vocal or synth lead, around the 200 hertz being a lot of the bass, maybe a touch of chord and bass and then sub, and then everything up here, and also your snare should be down here as well. You should hear that clearly. Everything above 5 kilohertz being a lot of the hi-hats, cymbals, and any other ear candy kind of air that you might add. Most of the time it's going to be hi-hats and cymbals. We can hear that directly when I scroll through this example. This is mostly just drums. A little bit of the high end of the piano gets through here, but 90% of the sound here is coming from the cymbals. And a little bit of the snare. This is all cymbals. All hi-hats. Looking lower. Ah, there's our bass. Here's our kick. Our snare should be right about here. Yep. Going up a little bit, we should be getting into our chords. A little bit of that lead, but again, 500 hertz overlaps. Around here should be almost no lead at all, and here's the most of our chords and the bulk of the weight of the bass. 2 kilohertz. A lot of where the harshness lives. We've already done a good job to tame it. It'll always sound harsh by itself. Be careful when sweeping like this. It's the idea of, yes, because it's solo alone, you first want to listen closely and then use this to identify the thing that sounds like what you were hearing was wrong. You don't want to use this to really diagnose problems, because of course it's always going to sound bad if you do this. Ooh, I think it has too much 5 kilohertz. Well, yeah. You just boosted there to look for the range. You want to identify, I think it has too much 5 kilohertz. Oh wait, no, what it was? Your room was lower. Ah, there it is. Sort of deal. We might actually add a little bit more high end to one of these hi-hat loops. Not that one. Maybe this one? Let's do very, very slight reduction around 200 hertz, like a decibel. Because again, a decibel here and a decibel there, a decibel somewhere else in the same region is going to be 3 decibels by the time you're done. Little tiny cuts near the end. Once you've decided you like roughly where you like things. And that's going to be every mixer and producer will have their own style of what they want for to be in certain frequency ranges. Because I could very well have chosen to emphasize the bass's own 200 hertz around here, but instead I kind of like the piano, just because maybe I'm biased as a pianist. Those strings on the side can come up a little in lows. Thing I note here is we've got a little bit of a brightness bias towards the right side. Let's see about evening that out a little. I might pan one of these a little bit more left. Listen to it all the way through. I'll pull up millimeters so we can check our LUFs. One little change, that poor electric piano is not nearly forward enough. Let's just do a little bit of a high shelf. There we go. pretty good to me. All right, right at 3:30. That's a good. Oh, shush. There we go. That's a good 2.5 hours. Any questions? How do you know when you're done? That is one of the hardest questions to answer. Generally, it's when you can't really find any more obvious problems. Now, you do have to be careful. The longer you mix a song, the more you get biased in certain ways. One of the things I will say with the quick decision making, never, ever hyper focus on a specific sound or sound region. The second I start thinking universally that like the 2.5 kilohertz or something is too bright and I get obsessed over that, there will never be any part that's going to sound correct if you are tuned in to it. It's another skill of just mix a lot and make very fast decisions so you don't have any time to get used to how it sounds either wrong or with a problem. The big one being is that if I were to really just like hyper focus on this, if I hyper focus on that, you will tune into that. And then you'll end up with a case where you'll be constantly listening just for that one sort of tone or frequency area and not be making good decisions in regard to the overall mix. That's when it's time to kind of step back, let your ears rest for 15 minutes, go listen to some other music or a very broad, or go listen to a completely different genre so you can sort of refresh your ears on tonal balance and everything and then come back to it. And it always, of course, helps to, once you get a mix, come back to it the next day. I do that constantly too. Doing one mix just all the way through will not be perfect, but you can train yourself to avoid these things. The big one being identifying something beforehand. I think there's too much so-and-so here. You grabbing an EQ, getting ready to attenuate that or boost it if you want to, and not spending more than 30 seconds doing that before you just move on to another sound. Because the second you start spending too long listening to it, you'll get hyper focused on that exact frequency, and it's never going to sound right. The big one also, there's a few metering things. This will come with experience. Let me pull up a spectrogram. You'll start mixing towards a more flat tonal balance. It doesn't have to be perfectly flat, but it's something that you'll get an ear for, which is doing a lot of mixing and listening to. I will say specifically, listen to professionally produced tracks. A lot of stuff, what you hear on the radio, start listening to the sound profile of those things. Not perfectly flat, but very flat. This is normal to have a little bump here in the bass. But yeah, this is fairly flat and equally balanced, and that just comes with experience. Mix a lot of music, and you'll get an ear for what is sort of flat tonality. Not like lifelessly flat, but just kind of the overall idea is just balance. We don't want to have especially too much high end or too much low end. Different genres have different amounts, but even if you look closely, go listen to very, very different genres. Go listen to Sub Focus, for example, does drum and bass, and just note mentally where the levels are of things are in comparison to each other. Because a lot of the time, it's all the same rough balance. Drum and bass will have a really big, thick respace, but the respace is also going to be responsible for the first like 1 all the way up to 1 kilohertz, pretty much on the frequency spectrum, and even going into the 5 kilohertz, to where it's not that the frequency balance changes a lot. It's what instruments are allotted to those frequencies. Because a lot of drum and bass doesn't even have chords. The bass is 50% of the entire mix in that case. And it has its own unique emotional and tonal characteristics that come from that. I see multiple people are typing. These are, you can find just charts online that explain these. Let me see. I can go over them very quickly. So a lot of it is very straightforward. Audio engineers is very relaxed in terms of the actual engineering side, so don't worry too much. A transient is the click. We can think of any sound. Let me pull up Paint. This is known as ADSR, attack, decay, sustain, and release. Or sorry, AD, ASDR, ASDR. Let me draw. Okay, so every sound we start thinking of it as not what it is, but more of just how it behaves. So boom, here's time, here's amplitude, and it's just a tone. I'll insert pokies real quick. This is a title of top down semi clip to zero. Virtual Riot does this a lot, as well as a lot of EDM producers. It's becoming more popular a lot in the J scene too. If you start listening to a lot of the Japanese Vocaloid producers, you'll start hearing this style, especially with regards to the transients. This has unique. You can't get this drum sound with any other way. This drum sound is unique to this mixing style, but that doesn't mean you can't get good drums any other way. There's other mixing styles that might have less punchy drums. This is unique in that drum hits induce a lot of saturation. Another way that they kind of do this, if you ever want to with a more traditional style, is you'll make a master of your track, and then if you want more drums, you go grab your kick and your snare from the original project, layer them into the master channel, and then throw a limiter on that. Then we'll get a unique scenario where the drums are also the most forward thing. But this is becoming a much more popular workflow, especially because it's unique to computers. Analog equipment doesn't have hard clipping in the same degree. It has soft clipping, but that's less precise and way less transparent for drum mixes. Putting a clipper on your master is blasphemy 10 years ago. Nowadays, it's becoming pretty standard practice. The specific asterisk being we're not pushing it like this. Not that. We're pushing it just the peaks of the transients and just hitting. And if you end up, because it's great with this utility, if you find you mixed a little bit too hot going into it, you can just turn down the gain a little bit. And of course, you can use all regular mastering tools. You can throw a compressor before this clipper if you want to bring up the low stuff just as much as you want. You can still use this in traditional mastering chain. It just gives you another tool to where this is more workflow, especially towards self-produced things. You guys are probably not sending your stuff to professional mastering engineers, so it's good to learn this tool yourself, and you can master your song in the mix. The only place where you want to actually, if you do this a lot, all your songs are going to fit each other, regardless of genre and tonality. You'll get your own mixing style and own tonality to it, to where you can make an album and not have to worry about having the songs be mastered to each other. They'll automatically fit because you made them. I'll go back into the terminology thing. So transient is, let's imagine a drum, or heck, let's pretend this is a synth sound. All right, so here's our volume. This section is known as attack. Here to here is sustain. Let's do that. If I get this right. Attack, sustain. This is decay. And this is release. The R part is more for synths. This is after you let off the note. If it ends either abruptly or releases. But sustain and decay. Actually, oops, sorry, I did get that backwards. It's decay from the maximum amplitude. This is decay. Decay, sustain. So this is where the bulk of the sound is. a lot of drums will be, for example, let me turn off noise suppression so I can make these sounds. There we go. So this will be the of a drum to be like a snare. Here would be the decay, so the reduction in amplitude from that. Sustain would be the sh part of a snare, and release would be the sh. Thus we get or as a way of thinking about it. And we apply this knowledge to all sounds. The transient specifically is this bit here. The very sharp, if you look at a waveform, it will look something like this, of like a drum. This is the transient. And then this, for the most part, would just be kind of the decay or sustain. This nomenclature is specifically for synth sound design. But most decay or sustain will be the body of it. Compression can reduce the peaks by, or we can chop them up so that we can say if this is our, we have a limit, there's headroom. If our transient is literally peaking right at maximum, remember this is opposite phase. So this would be positive and this is negative. A sound has to oscillate back and forth. So this is positive phase, opposite phase. Headroom will look like this. We can shave off the top of these things so that we can extend the drum sound to be more like this. Boom. And now it's just louder in general. But it's also fuller because when we chopped off the top, we added extra transients and thus we can't show it like this. It gets more dense in frequency content. Let's see. I jumped around a few. I worked a little bit on FL. I don't like FL at all. The big issue with FL is how many clicks it takes to do anything and letting you get routing wrong. I say this specifically for mixing. Get your channel, every individual sound. This is really only an FL thing. Make sure all your sounds are sent to individual channels. You need to be able to control every single sound. We remember to get a mix like this, we have done something on literally every single sound except for the risers. But they're just risers, they're flavor. Every single tonal instrument has a EQ or compressor and is getting bussed. We have controlled everything, and we need that level of control. I wouldn't have been able to get drums like this if I was just given, like, if the drums were just from the drum bus as a get-go, because I did specific things to the kick that I didn't do to the snare, and I don't want the same things happening to the snare that are happening to the kick. Drums, at the very least, need to be completely separate. You can have the hi-hat percussion loops, but the most control, the more you can separate every sound, at least two individual instruments. You don't need to separate by note. High-level bass music does do this, though. They will mix per note. It's ridiculous. But that's how they get those crazy sounds. I mean, like, they'll mix like an EQ on every single, like, if there's a three-note melody, they'll have 3 channels, and each of those channels will have different EQ processing on it for each of those 3 different notes that comprise the melody. It's ridiculous. That's more than necessary, but you'll get eventually, experimentation. You'll find something. Maybe you'll like the way it sounds so much, like, it's worth doing it every time, kind of deal. EQ shelves. Okay. Cover artists when they mix. So this is known as 2-track mixing or more track, but generally it's called 2-track. This is where, if I want to mix a vocal into something, I can be given let me steal something very quickly. I'd have something like, an earlier mix of this from like a month ago, but this would be a case just to showcase what they'd be given and what they'd work with. Let me make a new audio channel. There we go. Here's a different mix. Oops, sound suppression. There we go. They would have this and then an audio channel, and generally just be working with throwing an EQ on the full instrumental and making some space around 200 hertz, 500 hertz, 2 kilohertz, and 5 kilohertz for the vocal. 200 hertz is fundamental of most vocals. 500 hertz is a lot of the regular sort of sound. 2 kilohertz to 3 kilohertz, humans are most sensitive to, are the most important for intelligibility. If you have a vocal part and this goes away, you lose the ability to understand the words and formants that are being said. 5 kilohertz also are related to that, but that's more towards the getting into consonant sounds kind of deals. 2 kilohertz is more of the formant combined with 500 and 200. Usually vocals have a roll off down here. Mainly that's because think of how a lot of it comes down to how we actually hear sounds in real life. You don't usually talk to other humans 2 inches from your ear. However, the presumption when even synth and stuff is that they're based off of vocal recordings, and recordings are done how far from a microphone? About 2 inches. Thus, a side effect of that is we end up with a lot more low tones than would actually be expected in real life. Because a lot of what we're doing with mixing, especially vocals, is we're trying to trick the brain that this sound is coming from a reasonable physical location. That's what reverb does to help with, and also the EQ. Specifically, a lot of attenuation around 200 to 500 hertz, especially with vocal synths. But yeah, they'll generally, depending on how fancy, they'll be left with, here's just the instrumental, and then they'll cut some space, and then hopefully, if things work out, the vocal will fill the spaces that they cut with EQ. They can use a dynamic EQ that will automatically cut some space from the vocal. Freaking Soothe too, you just slap it on the main thing and then sidechain it, and now the vocal is going to automatically spectral sidechain itself through, meaning it'll act like an EQ that is down to like frequency level detail rather than being broad strokes like this. It'll be pretty much almost perfect and perfectly cut the shape of the vocal out of the frequency response of the original instrumental and build a sound that way. It's humans kind of prefer broader strokes with EQ. Having things like that can feel a little bit uncanny because your brain will determine that, hey, this sound plus that sound as it was before should be increasing in volume, but aren't, and thus you'll get kind of an uncanny valley effect from it, to where your brain knows that this is not how sounds add together kind of deal. So the best mixing practices tend to use like a light hand on multiple methods. There'll be a little bit of bass cut, and then if you want to use like Soothe 2 or Spectral Sidechain, there'll be a little bit of that to help push it along rather than 100% one or the other. But genuinely, being able to control every instrumental track means that you can focus on just a few things that do work. And also mid-side EQ. Like if the vocal center, I don't need to remove information from the side channels, which is a whole nother topic of specifically that's going to be phase differences, which is a side channel, and phase correlation is the mid channel. It's essentially how wide things sound. The vocals are usually dead center, and they're the same. They don't sound like they're coming from all around you. They sound like they're coming directly in front of you, sort of deal. And some sounds sound like they come from beside you. That helps with psychoacoustics and discerning sounds from each other. It gives our brain something to latch onto. If there's a regular difference between sounds, that's how panning works. Is it says, oh, I can identify the guitar, even if it's a little bit frequency masked, because I know the guitar is coming. It's always the signal from the guitar is coming a little bit from the right. Same for even just throwing things stereo wide, like a synth. For example, is that if I have the synth, there we go. Here's mono, simple unison of 2. Now it's 100% wide, and this sounds like it's coming from all around. This sounds mono. Turns out you can completely use these two, as long as they're different sounds, separate instruments from each other. Now we have a square wave that's wide and a mono saw, and we can hear both. It sounds a little bit funny with the square wave, but with more complex sounds, this effect stacks to where now we can fit more sound in than seems it would fit. But one of the things that you do have to watch out for is that when in mono, that width does start to fall apart. And our brains also have a tendency to know what it would sound like in mono. So if something always seems off about a song, check that the frequency balance of the things that you have wide in the stereo field are correct, because again, perceived loudness increases when we pan things left to right. Things directly in front of us sound the least loud. If you pan something all the way to the right, it will sound louder than if it was just panned dead center, even though no signal change, no volume change actually occurred. But our brains kind of know that and will make things also sound uncanny. If you're having struggle with a mixed where it can't ever sound, it seems both too bright and too dark at the same time, check the things that you have in the stereo field, because there's likely an issue coming from there. Because our brains are saying, hey, I know what things should sound like in mono, and I also know that things are louder on the side, but your brain kind of automatically reduces the loudness of that. Or it knows that it's not actually any louder, but if it's not like balanced to the mono signal, which is also a good thing to check mixes in mono. Now, not all mixes will work in mono. That's just a side effect. But this mix example will work in mono because it is balanced across the stereo field. Notice that we don't lose anything. Let's see. Biggest thing that some people usually struggle with. Biggest one being tonal balance. And getting proper loudness, not sort of the harsh loudness. From what I hear a lot of it does come down to having too many things playing low frequencies. That's the classic thing. It seems funny to high pass everything, but really it's kind of standard. Not saying that you have to do it, but a lot of sort of issues with clarity come from like 200 hertz and below having too much happening there, especially with bass. That is anything that's playing bass, be acoustic, be a recording. That's what all the mixing sort of tools are out there for, is anything below 100 hertz. Generally, you have one thing playing that at once, ever. The higher you go in the frequency range, the more you can get away with it. We don't care if you have a piano and the guitars and everything playing in the high frequencies. There's more space up there. Think about it. 1 to 5 kilohertz is 5,000 hertz. 100 to 20 hertz is 80. There's orders of magnitude less information down there. We don't have the information for timbre, for separation. Thus, generally, keep bass mono and keep it clean. Reduce elements that are playing low frequency content, and especially in your compositions, decide from the get-go what you're going to have down there, if you're going to have something down there. Generally, if it's like pop music or, a full powerful instrumental, your kick's probably going to be there. Your kick's going to be there, and probably your bass is going to be around there. And there's a solution. That's the only things that are going to be playing down there. And then be over sterile at first, and then start creeping back in. Because the big one is that you'll end up with phase cancellation, which will not only make your bass level inconsistent, it will flutter up and down, which when your limiter sees that, if we have a very, like we're trying to get the perceived average bass level, consider like if the level of the signal is going crazy up and down, we hear average levels over time. Our brains automatically smooth over those volume differences, but the meters do not. The meters see random spikes of plus 20, minus 10, plus 20, minus 10, plus 20, minus 10. And what's going to happen to the end chain when we try to get this any louder? It's going to do something like this. Or if I just, very example, we have a clipper on this. If I were to just randomly, this is the classic sort of case. You'll know you've run into this when you start hearing the entire track tremolo flutter at like 60 hertz. This is kind of the sound. The whole track is fluttering because of the bass. In some genres, like trap, it's intentional, but the good producers there are doing this with a different method. That is by clipping the bass track and the kick together, and then boosting the bass a lot. But again, it's not the master ever has to. It's essentially we just put a clipper on our bass and then boost the sub a lot, so then it alternates, but it's still controlled. The idea is that the master channel is not having to do anything hardly. A perfect sort of master channel in this case is it does nothing. Like it might be EQ a cut if you want to change something somewhere, but it's mostly just checking levels. Oh, thank you, Lookbite. I like Vital. It's a synth. Should look synthy. Phasing shelves. Oh, right. I'll go over the EQ differences. In an EQ that won't ruin this. I undid this, right? Okay, good. This is known as a bell curve. Mouse wheel or the Q. Q is its own thing. Every freaking EQ company has their own formula for how this works. It's not consistent at all, even though mathematically it's supposed to be. But it's generally just the sharpness of it and how broad it is. So you can just think of Q whenever you hear the Q as just how sharp and specific you like. Gain will be up or down. It's either negative or positive. Frequency, of course, is the frequency that it's acting at. There's a few. This one only has two types because there's really just two in fundamental theory. Peaking, which is bell curve, or a shelf, which this is a ramp. You'll also see it called ramp as well. Where's the shelf? There it is. Boom. It boosts. This notes the curves at 6 decibels per octave, starting from 873 hertz, roughly. The mathematics of why this happens are complex and are above me a little bit, but you don't really need to know them other than generally how it works out is that it's smooth curves generally. This is the shelf. Notice how it makes just pretty much a consistent boost below level. Different shelves will have, some side effects. You definitely look at the EQ and what it's doing. The way that math works for frequency attenuation ends up, it's not perfect. It can never be perfect, which is a half of what the skill, or a good part of what the skill of mixing is, knowing the imperfections in it. This specifically, because I've increased the Q essentially on this shelf, what ends up happening is it will also flip polarity near, I do believe this term is called Nyquist, basically where the EQ reaches 0 again. There's a whole bunch of math involved with Fourier analysis and stuff of why this happens and has to happen, but just be aware, your EQ will do a good job of showing you what it's doing. So a shelf like this is also putting a resonant peak that's higher than my shelf and a resonant peak below it. There's a few, the old analog EQs had specific sort of things that they did as quirks, sort of, because of analog hardware that tended to get popular and famous. This sort of thing, example, like, oh, you want to boost a low end, they think, oh, it's boosted even more because it's also got a big bump around 100 hertz, and oh, it seems to remove mud because it's also, this is actually an example of one, like the older analog EQs doing things like this, exactly being, oh, I want to boost low end, well, it also made it seem more clear because it reduced mud, because yeah, look, this Q hits into the 200 hertz region. It's also boosting our low end and high harmonics of the low end. This would be like the top end of a bass. So let me see any more questions. EQ shelves, passes. Oh, passing, I just mean like going through the mix again. I'll do initial sort of rough mix and then go again with a more detailed mix of really noting down, being more nitpicky about it, and then third kind of phase, just listening through. If I can't identify any obvious problems for the most part, and I'll do a few sort of guesses at what I think might be an improvement. If there's no obvious improvement, I'll be like, you know what, done. Come back to it maybe another day and then see if there's any differences. In fact, funnily enough, I have like 3 mixes of this song now. I'm curious to see how close. Oh, high pass, low pass. Sorry. This is what it says on the tin. High pass is will just cut below a certain thing. There's usually you can either control this by what will be known as Q, or they'll say decibels per octave. 12 is the standard. Low passing, do be careful doing this on kicks. Again, also how this works. You'll see something also known as linear phase or minimum phase. That's a special thing on EQs that are kind of solely in the digital realm, where in order to cut low frequency content, we have like a 30 hertz sine wave. We have to apply the opposite to it. That's all EQs do. They apply the opposite frequency to the sound spectrum. But low frequency waves oscillate up and down, sine waves, right? They go up and they go down. This is the full oscillation here to here. Well, in order to subtract that, we need to be going down here. Cool. So we'll do this, right? Here's the negative waveform. The issue stems is that without knowing what's coming ahead, we can't start more than 0. We always have to start at 0. Meaning that if I am late to see that this signal isn't coming and I want to reduce it, oh, there's a signal here, let's do this. Because we were late by some amount of seeing that signal, we don't attenuate it fully. The rough way that this is gone about is we'll do some look ahead. So we're going to look a little bit in the future. This is what introduces a little bit of latency, like a couple milliseconds. That's all it needs for a computer. As we'll see, we'll look at we're right here. We're going to peek ahead and see, there's about to be let me check a little bit more forward, a 30 hertz sine wave about to hit. So let me start so that I'm ready in time to counteract it. I'll start earlier with my phase and start doing this. Boom, yay, now we've canceled it in time. However, what about all of this? Think about that. If you ever play with EQs and multiple DAWs, you'll notice when you do low cuts that the average signal level increases despite no increase in volume. There is an increase in signal level. This is inaudible. This gets into the higher order of sort of audio engineering side, but there's different ways EQs manage to do this and try to solve this. Very fancy, I do believe it's called minimum phase ones, actually look really far ahead in the future, like 40 milliseconds to make sure that they are ready to go. But something that incurs no delay is reactionary. And it's reactionary about it looks a millisecond ahead, but in order to attenuate this in time, it will cause what's known as pre-ringing. Is that it's going to start making this opposite phase sound before the actual sound happens. What happens with this, and this is if you ever do any crazy things with EQ, like boosts like this, you'll notice that if I have, say, it's best, maybe I'll make a beep over here or something. We'll notice that as I boost the frequency of the beep, just from like a vital sine wave, let's put a beep over here. There we go. It's going to be a very simple, tiny beep. Sine wave. There you go. Little beep. Perfect. It's a beep. Sine wave. Fast attack. Instant release. Cool. We've got a beep, and it's exactly... It's exactly that long. Let's make it even shorter. There. Barely even long enough to notice. Right. Let me throw an EQ on this. This is an important thing to note. Okay, cool. Let's boost this. It should just be louder, right? It should just be louder. What was that? That wasn't just louder, was it? This is a sine wave. I'll lower the volume so we're not clipping or anything. What the? No EQ. It's fast and tight. EQ. Notice it's increasing the sustain. That is because it's pre-ringing. It's adding this signal early. Thus, if we look at this closely, let me render a track. I'll extend this here. One with an EQ. I'll make a duplicate. I'll render it to audio, and we're going to see that the beep starts earlier with the boost on it. Let's see, duplicate, and then no EQ on this one. This will be our pure transformed audio track. Render inserts, remove instrument, fixed tail of 1 second. Zoom in a lot. There we go. Look at that. That's a beep. Little sine wave. Let's render this one. Render inserts, remove instrument, fixed tail, 1 second. Ooh, actually, this EQ works a little bit on the opposite. They either start early or last too long. This actually one prefers lasting too long. So, all we did was do an EQ boost. This is just a sine wave. It's just a single frequency. All we did was boost the EQ that the frequency was already at. There's no other information. And we got this. Note that it's like 8 times as long in sustain. The volume is not even consistent. This is a consistent straight volume beep. This is now a non-inconsistent volume. It now varies and has attack and sustain. Just something to think of. Now imagine what this does to drum transients with a low pass. The simplest thing is it smears them. It will butter knife them. It will remove the pop and the power of transients for like kicks. So do not high pass a kick for the most part. Unless you set your EQ, they'll have a specific button that does it the fancy way, where it tells the EQ to wise up and look ahead more. This one on Studio One is known as the low cut button. Watch my latency down here. So it's at 3.9 milliseconds. The second I turn this button on, 45 milliseconds. It's looking 45 milliseconds into the future to make sure that it doesn't smear the transients. Linear phase will avoid all those issues that you saw with the no delay sort of EQ, where we end up with, for the most part, this is a completely different sound. But it incurs a cost of lots of latency. So it's good to do in the pure mixing stage. You don't really need to worry about it for high frequency content, but any low sub stuff will either be, depends on the EQ. A lot of EQs work slightly different math. You'll either get a case where it sustains too long. Some of them will have the sound start way too early to try to like compensate. And then others will be too long. This actually specific EQ has quite a bit of volume variation in it. Even though this is just saying, we just told it to increase that frequency by like 12 decibels, all it should have done in theory is it should have just done this. That's not what we got at all. So just a little thing to work out. The biggest thing is that all the processing and the plugins and the tools all incur their own quirks of imperfection. It's good if you can do something with minimal processing, because the more you do it, the more you'll run into these effects will stack up. If you can, run only a single EQ to get the sound you want. The more you keep stacking the line, the more we're getting this through all of our sounds and all of our changes. Let's see, there was another. Yeah, high pass, low pass is just a high pass, also known as a low cut. So they're the same thing. Low cut is also used for shelves. Shelves can be either or. Let me reduce the Q. There's a shelf. Ooh, low shelf. Also a low shelf. It's a little bit ambiguous there. We could call it low cut shelf or low shelf cut or low shelf boost. Or boost with a shelf or cut with a shelf. This is known as just high pass, meaning everything above some hertz will be passed. Same thing for low pass, meaning that we let low information through. Ooh, there we go. This one is actually labeled in Studio One as high cut, and then low cut, low cut. But let's see. Phasing is, I went over it a little bit, but it's a lot of one of the things to look out for in phasing is if you have two identical sounds and you try to stereo pan them left and right, you'll just end up with a mono signal. If you try to delay one or the other a little bit forward in time or backwards in time, you'll end up with comb filtering. Comb filtering sounds like comb filters, in that like every other frequency gets phase canceled in a certain pattern relating to what the original sound was. It sounds funny and robotic. Kind of like you're listening through like a coffee can or something, or a metal duct. Let's see. Let me make sure I have this back to normal sound. No, I modified something. Let's see if we can identify that. What did I just ruin? Something has a crazy boost on it. There it is. Let's do that. That's better. I'm half curious. This is a mix I did like 1.5 months ago. See if there's any difference. Oh, hold on. Let's turn off the EQ on that. As you can see, you'll eventually get to the point where you mix things very similar to each other. And thus, you'll get into a flow of what works for your music, especially. So yeah, this is an entirely different mixing session I did over a month ago, and they're 95% similar. I have a few different effects on this one that I use for space on the lead. I put a little bit of delay on it, but tonal balance is 95% the same. Let's A-B them. There you go. Okay, I'm kind of half. They're almost identical. This is an entirely different mix section. I started completely from scratch with this new one. I deleted every single thing and reset all the gain. Proof in the pudding that 100% it's learnable, and you'll get into a consistency that you just don't have to worry about anymore. Once you figure out what you like, you'll keep doing it. I thought there was going to be more differences myself. This is ridiculous. I'm freaking out about this. Holy moly. They're almost identical. Oh, that's starting from scratch for both. Little bit of differences here and there, but I started getting into mixing about 2 years ago when I started electronic production. Granted, I've been doing mixing and learning about the subject for about like 4 hours a day for the past 2 years, so that helps. The big one is I always send my stuff constantly in for feedback from a lot of professional audio engineers. I only started doing this at Vocal Synth when I started getting no feedback back from the professional audio engineers, where it was just like personal preference decisions. They're so close. There's a little bit of difference in the low mid range, but I can't say I prefer one or the other. This is very much, you'll get to a point where you don't worry so much about every little detail of the mix. Just make sure it sounds good, because yes, these two are different, and I could spend hours trying to figure out the exact differences, but for the most part, they both sound good. This one's a little bit louder, just in LUFS, but they're within like 0.5 LUFS of each other anyway, from what I hear. It's all just, you don't worry about being a perfectionist with your mix. Because just keep practicing mixing and you'll get there, and for the most part, if it just sounds good to you, don't worry about if all the little tiny differences. For the most part, somebody that hears this and the other version that we just did today is going to be just as happy. If they like this one, they'll like that one. And thus, don't sweat it. Just make sure that the bass is controlled and drums are popping, and we're making at least intentional decisions regarding panning and EQ and just choosing which instruments do what. But let's see. Unless there's any more questions, I think I'll just about be wrapping up now. Yes, Jiga, you could just DM me the recording, or slap it to a Google Drive or something. Any way that I can download it, I'll upload it to my channel. And thank you very much for recording. I'm sad that I don't know what was freaking out about OBS, but I wanted to be able to read chat at the same time. Last time I did one of these, I couldn't read chat. I had to tab over to my phone. Alrighty, thank you everyone for attending. I hope I've been enlightening to see a full mix. And just that it's not, you don't have to be super stressed or anything about it. Just kind of work on it to sound good. Keep in mind tonal balance as you're mixing, and you don't have to get it perfect on the first pass. I always like to do just very setup change. You find a workflow that works for you. You don't have to use my workflow, for example. Just have something in mind that you seek to reduce the amount of hair pulling that you're actively doing, and make fast and quick decisions about things. If you hear something that sounds wrong, don't wait until it sounds normal. Try to do a little adjustment early. Goes a long way in the end. You don't want to do big adjustments late. You want to do little adjustments early, and those will add up for a very cohesive and, as you can see, repeatable sound. It's been my pleasure. All right, take care, everyone. Class dismissed.